la toute dernière conférence dans la série qui est organisée conjointement par l'Association France-Grande Bretagne, qui existe depuis plus d'un siècle et qui cherche à rapprocher les deux peuples, et le CRECIB, le Centre de recherche en civilisation britannique dont je suis le président, qui est une association de 200-220 chercheurs universitaires qui travaillent sur la civilisation britannique et l'ex-empire, les colonies et tout cela. Et alors aujourd'hui, c'est un petit peu différent parce qu'on va commencer par l'annonce du prix de thèse en civilisation britannique qui est donné par et qui est décerné par le CRECIB tous les deux ans. Donc pendant 10 minutes, on va faire ça. Je vais parler des thèses et puis je vais annoncer la personne qui a gagné. Personne ne le sait pour l'instant, pratique. En tout cas, si vous n'êtes pas au CIA, voilà. Et ensuite, nous passerons donc à la conférence qui est un petit peu en forme de conversation aujourd'hui. Nous avons Natalie Bennett qui siège à la Chambre des Lords pour le Parti écologiste britannique, le Green Party, et elle va nous expliquer plein de choses alléchantes sur son travail et sur l'institution. Voilà, donc tout d'abord, le prix de thèse du CRECIB. Je voudrais commencer par remercier le jury. On était 6, Anne et Virginie ici présentes, moi-même, Laurent, Anita et Philippe, c'est-à-dire les membres du bureau du CRECIB, qui ont examiné les thèses et le prix est décerné tous les 2 ans. Donc cette fois, il s'agissait d'une thèse en civilisation britannique dirigée par un membre du CRECIB et soutenue en 2022 ou en 2023. Et nous avons reçu 10 thèses. D'un côté, on était content qu'il y avait 10 thèses, de l'autre côté, c'était quand même 10 thèses, voilà. Certaines écrites en français et d'autres en anglais, ce n'était pas un critère. Et là, je vais dire mais littéralement 2 phrases sur chacun des 10 thèses. Avant d'annoncer donc qui a gagné. Alors, notre première thèse, et je devrais signaler qu'ils sont en ordre alphabétique, c'était par Marie Awanès Ferrière, dirigée par Vincent Latour de Toulouse, et le titre c'est Grassroots Mobilization Against Brexit and its impact on pro-European sentiment in the UK from the 2016 referendum to the end of exit negotiations, a case study of Liverpool for Europe. Alors c'est une étude qui aborde une riche variété de questions sur la constitution et l'activité des réseaux anti-Brexit. Et ça comprend une étude de cas détaillée de Liverpool for Europe. Si je lis un petit extrait du rapport sur cette thèse, un beau travail de mise en lien de la théorie et de la pratique, de l'ethnographie et de l'observation participante. La première thèse, la deuxième, ils sont très très variés. La deuxième thèse en ordre alphabétique, ça a été fait par François Bourmeau, dirigé par Fabrice Simon et Patrick Clastre, et le titre c'est Les Britanniques et le développement des sports en France de 1815 à 1914. Une thèse qui apporte un éclairage très intéressant sur l'histoire du sport en France, l'histoire des transferts culturels et sportifs, mais aussi de manière plus générale sur l'histoire des relations franco-britanniques. On explore notamment l'adoption en France du modèle britannique en sport hippique et nautique, et aussi, et vous ne saviez pas, l'échec de la diffusion du cricket en France sous la Seconde Empire. Voilà, donc tout est la faute à Napoléon III au fond. En troisième lieu, nous avons une thèse faite par Anne Dao-Bouitran, encore sous la direction de Fabrice Ben-Simon, et le titre c'est The Birth of a Bridge, The Building of the Victoria Bridge in Montreal, 1853 to 1859. Donc, vous voyez seulement une période de 6 ans où ils ont construit un pont tout à fait extraordinaire pour l'époque. L'auteur défend la thèse que l'histoire du risque et l'histoire des accidents du travail au XIXe siècle peut énormément éclairer l'histoire d'une classe ouvrière dont les sources écrites sur le vécu sont rares. Le jeune chercheur, je cite le rapport, le jeune chercheur adopte une lecture à rebours des archives des entreprises en tirant des conclusions éclairantes à partir des lacunes et des non-dits impressionnantes. En quatrième position, enfin, alphabétique. Nous avons M. Dang, Kwok Dang, dirigé par Romain Garbet. Et le titre de sa thèse, c'est Chinatown, a Western Brand, a comparative study of London's Chinatown and of the quartier asiatique de Paris. Le sujet est abordé sous un angle original, celui du branding. C'est une analyse comparative du quartier asiatique de Paris ainsi que du Chinatown londonien. Et ça démontre comment a marché un certain branding multiculturel en Angleterre, où il y a eu une alliance des forces, des agences publiques et privées pour promouvoir la spécificité du Chinatown, là où, et vous l'imaginez bien, à Paris, les choses se sont passées très différemment. Notre cinquième thèse est une comparatiste à nouveau. Il s'agit de la thèse de Slimane Agha, dirigée par Rosemary Fambine, qui est maintenant à la retraite, mais bon, qui a dirigé cette thèse. Et le titre Jeu de miroir, représentation croisée et colonialité, histoire des analogies et anti-analogies entre les conflits anglo-irlandais et franco-algériens de 1830 à 1998. Voilà, nous étions très impressionnés par cette thèse, excellente maîtrise de l'historiographie et des concepts, positionnement scientifique novateur et une citation du rapport, thèse savante qui mobilise des sources primaires très variées et qui propose une démonstration efficace et nuancée. En sixième, nous avons quelque chose de complètement différent. Ici, on est plus dans l'époque contemporaine. C'est la thèse de Emerence Hitt, sous direction de Eleni Bata, les enjeux politiques du discours identitaire dans la propagande électorale du Scottish National Party, 1967-2015. Et la thèse étudie la trajectoire du Scottish National Party des années 60 à 2015. C'est un parti qui est passé du statut d'une formation politique exclusivement centrée sur la question nationale au statut d'un parti politique moderne qui devait donc s'occuper de l'ensemble des questions. Une bonne thèse, très sérieuse, avec un gros travail d'interprétation du matériel électoral. En septième position, c'est Fanette Pradon qui a écrit une thèse, Le système de Glasgow, le placement en institution des filles perdues entre 1851 et 1901. Elle a été dirigée par Véronique Molinari. J'avais noté une étude originale qui comble un manque dans l'historiographie existante. Exploitation d'archives jusqu'alors peu étudiées, principalement les registres d'institutions à vocation répressive ou carcérale. Une approche embrassant les différentes facettes du sujet d'un point de vue institutionnel, socio-économique et culturel, démonstration rigoureuse et efficace. Et on avait également noté qu'on avait vraiment l'impression d'y être, parce que c'était un portrait de la vie à Glasgow très vivante. En huitième position, c'est M. Stéphane Révillé, dirigé par Agnès Alexandre Collier, qui a écrit une thèse dont le titre est L'expression du leadership des premiers ministres conservateurs pendant les Prime Minister's Question Time de 1990 à 2019. Alors, le Prime Minister's Question Time, c'est une séance, je crois, hebdomadaire à la Chambre des communes, où, voilà, comme le nom indique, où le Premier ministre est questionné. C'est une thèse qui déploie, à partir d'un point de départ assez resserré, une vision anthropologique aussi riche qu'originale. On a à la fois une caractérisation du leadership de chacun des premiers ministres, mais également une exégèse sur la manière dont cette séance hebdomadaire contribue à la formation du leadership. En neuvième position de l'alphabet, c'est Béatrice Rovich, dirigée par Fabrice Ben-Simon, qui a fait une thèse en anglais. Le titre, c'est Where are the children? The long decline of child labor in England and Wales from 1870 to 1914. Une thèse d'histoire de grande qualité qui essaie de juger l'importance relative des dispositions juridiques et des facteurs économiques et culturels dans l'explication du déclin rapide du travail des enfants pendant les 50 ans avant la Première Guerre. Une méthodologie originale qui combine approche qualitative et quantitative. Et le tout dernier, en ordre alphabétique, c'est Nicolas Sigoyer, également dirigé par Agnès Alexandre-Collier, qui a écrit une thèse en français, L'entrisme au sein du Parti travailliste britannique, de 1920 à 1992. La thèse examine comment des groupes radicaux tels que les communistes dans les années 20 ou les trotskistes dans les années surtout aux 60, 70, 80, ont travaillé au sein du Parti travailliste et avec quels résultats. Ça a été un sujet novateur, ambitieux, récit très sérieux, analyse extrêmement solide, sources primaires foisonnantes, bien comprises et contextualisées, et je voulais souligner, malgré les dangers d'une montagne de sources, toutes partisanes. Il n'y a que des sources partisanes. Alors, voilà, ce sont les thèses. Alors, vous ayant expliqué tout cela, vous comprenez que, voilà, que le niveau, qu'il y avait du niveau. Voilà. Et alors, on s'est obligé de refuser le ex-écho et de décider de prendre un seul. Et alors, je peux vous annoncer que la personne qui a gagné, c'est Fanette Pradon, avec sa thèse Le système de Glasgow, le placement dans l'institution des filles perdues entre 1851 et 1901. Je pense que ça vaut un applaudissement. Alors, j'ai réussi à joindre Fanette par téléphone. Il y a 2 jours, elle a pris les billets de train. Elle était prête à passer 16 heures en train pour passer 4 heures à Paris. Mais, bien sûr, ce matin, elle prend la voiture au-dessus de Gap. Et la neige a rendu la chose impossible, mais on va lui demander, elle est là en ligne avec un peu de chance, et on va lui demander de parler de 3 minutes pour accepter, j'espère. Oh, je devais dire qu'elle aura son certificat et quand même 1 000 euros, c'est déjà ça. Donc c'est un prix qui est un petit quelque chose rajouté. Est-ce qu'il est possible de voir Fanette là?
Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Oui, oui,
Oui.
on ne te voit pas.
Oui, alors j'ai des petits problèmes de connexion.
OK.
Je peux avoir une photo, j'essaie vainement d'avoir la vidéo, mais c'est compliqué. Déjà, si vous m'entendez, c'est une bonne chose.
Oui, c'est très très bien. Alors, tout d'abord, toutes mes félicitations, Fanette. Vraiment, c'était un travail extraordinaire.
Mais je vous remercie beaucoup. C'est vrai que bon, je tiens vraiment à remercier les membres du jury et aussi ma directrice de thèse. C'est aujourd'hui une belle surprise et surtout un grand honneur d'apprendre que j'obtiens ce prix de thèse. Alors, une grande surprise car je ne pensais pas que ma thèse puisse se démarquer de celle des participants qui concouraient à mes côtés. J'ai passé 6 années à étudier la mise en place et la chute d'un système de contrôle social visant à interner les adolescentes rebelles, ces filles perdues, comme vous disiez si bien. Donc des adolescentes qui ne correspondaient pas aux critères de la féminité, tels qu'édictés par la société victorienne. Mais c'est aussi un système qui fait écho, à mon sens, à ce que vivent certaines femmes aujourd'hui dans certains pays, mais surtout un système qui montre comment l'évolution économique et politique d'une société, à un moment donné, peut stigmatiser ou émanciper certaines minorités. Dans le cadre du système de Glasgow, il s'agissait à l'évidence de stigmatiser, d'interner et de formater les filles d'ouvriers destinées à la reproduction de la main-d'œuvre qui devait donner naissance à des ouvriers plus forts afin d'augmenter la productivité des industries de la ville. Donc, je remercie par conséquent le jury de permettre, si je puis dire, au calvaire et à l'injustice qu'ont subi les dites filles perdues internées par le système de Glasgow de gagner en reconnaissance, parce que c'est à mon sens l'élément le plus important dans l'obtention de ce prix. Cela va m'aider à poursuivre les recherches et à approfondir ce sujet, mais ça va aussi m'aider, je l'espère, à pouvoir publier ma thèse ou même la faire traduire afin qu'elle puisse être visible également dans le monde anglophone. Pour finir, voilà, je tiens à souligner que c'est un grand honneur d'obtenir ce prix, car contrairement aux autres prix, l'appréciation des jurys ne repose pas sur ce que j'ai compris, sur les rapports de soutenance. Et à mon sens, ça laisse l'opportunité à chacun d'être jugé en fonction de son travail et non pas en fonction de par qui ils sont représentés. Et c'est vraiment, je pense que c'est vraiment important. Donc pour cela, encore une fois, je vous remercie. Je vous remercie beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Valette, merci.
Et je m'excuse parce que la vidéo ne fonctionne pas. C'est compliqué en haut de la montagne. Je suis désolée.
Oui, effectivement, Valette a souligné un détail. Là, le jury ne voit pas les rapports de tête. Là, on ne peut pas les voir, on peut voir que la tête. Voilà. Bon, c'est très bien tout ça, mais ah, voilà, elle est là, super.
Finalement, ça fonctionne. J'ai réussi à assembler le téléphone et l'ordinateur. Je suis désolée, ça fonctionne maintenant.
C'est très bien comme ça. Nous savons que tu n'es pas une intelligence artificielle.
Exactement, voilà. Je ne suis pas une IA. Merci à vous.
OK. Alors, merci beaucoup aussi au public et merci aux autres 9 personnes qui ont concouru parce que comment dire, on ne s'est pas trop engueulé dans le jury, mais bon, ça a pris un peu de temps quand même. Voilà, donc on va passer à la suite. Je vous demande d'accueillir Natalie Bennett. Euh, qui a accepté de venir nous parler de la Chambre des Lords, représentant donc du Parti écologiste à la Chambre haute. Et on va changer, j'avais presque oublié, on va changer de langue. We're going to do this speech in English, of course. I can switch my English on. So welcome. So first of all, perhaps you could tell us how you ended up in the House of Lords. I mean, is your father a duke? Do you go fox hunting every Sunday?
No, well, as soon as I opened my mouth, and I should have begin by apologising for not doing this in French, but I can assure that you will all have a much better time if I don't. My French is a little agricultural, but one of the interesting things, if I go into a shop and I open my mouth and say anything in French, people go, "You're Australian." So if you're listening to the English, that's where the accent comes from. I was born in Australia. My father was an apprentice carpenter. He was 19 years old. My mother was 18 years old. And you would never have predicted where I would end up. There's a long story there, and I won't tell the full version, but it comes to, I spent 20 years as a journalist. I worked in Bangkok for 5 years. I was a volunteer at the National Commission of Women's Affairs in Thailand, but journalism was my trade. But I'm also unusual in politics, and that my first degree was actually in agricultural science. And one of the things that certainly in British politics, we desperately need more people from a scientific background in politics, because so many issues these days are scientific. And there's a real lack of scientific literacy in politics. So I have an agricultural science degree. I have 20 years of journalism. I finished up as editor of The Guardian Weekly, the international edition of The Guardian. And then on the 1st of January 2006, so it was a New Year's resolution to do something about the state of the world. And I joined the Green Party. And I would never have predicted it would lead me to the House of Lords. But I wanted to do something about the state of the world. And I'd always known as a journalist that at some time I would stop reporting the news and try and change the news. And on that 1st of January, I thought about joining Greenpeace or War on Want or organisations like that. But what I thought is, where decisions are made is in local councils, is in Westminster. Then, as we've just been hearing, it was in Brussels. And so I thought, I'm going to join the Green Party. 6 years later, I was elected as leader of the Green Party of England and Wales. When I was elected leader of the Green Party, we had about 9,000 members, and we had 1 MP and about 30 or 40 councillors. By the time I finished as leader of the Green Party in 2016, we had about 60,000 members. We just got 1.1 million votes in the 2015 general election. That was more votes than the Green Party had got in every previous general election added together. but we may talk later about the British electoral system. We still only got one MP, despite all of those votes. So I was leader of the party. We then had the Brexit referendum. I was then very tired after 4 years of that. And so I took a break, and then the Green Party was offered a seat in the House of Lords by Theresa May, and they democratically selected me to be that person. So that's how I became Baroness Bennett of Manor Castle. If you're looking me up in Hansard, that's Natalie to all of you.
Oh, okay, so in fact, Theresa May decided that she wanted a person from the Green Party in the House of Lords. What do you think that was?
It's interesting because Theresa May, I'm no defender of Theresa May. She was infamous when she was Home Office Secretary, so looking after things like migration. There was infamous go home bans that toured around the country suggesting very racist messages. But she was also someone who was seen as someone who kind of followed the rules. And there had been an independent commission a few years before that had said, looking at the votes the Greens are getting in elections, there should be more Greens. And also, she appointed what looked really shocking at the time, 4 members of her staff to be members of the House of Lords in the same group I was in. So I think the Green offer was a kind of trade-off for those members of her staff, and also because she was following the recommendation. But I think there's a point to be made about that, which is, if you ask me one word to describe the House of Lords, I would describe it as strange. Very strange. And one of the things that is strange about it is a majority of members are appointed. They're life peers, so you're only, whatever you live, I do describe it as a life sentence. So like being sent to prison for life, you get sent to the House of Lords for life. You can retire, actually, but most people are there because the Prime Minister decided to appoint them. And if you follow British news, you've probably seen there's been lots of controversy about Boris Johnson's resignation list and about Liz Truss's resignation list. But literally the Prime Minister can do whoever they like. And there is a committee that's supposed to vet people, but actually Boris Johnson appointed someone and the committee said he wasn't a fit and proper person, and Boris Johnson just put him in anyway.
Yes, so yeah, just for the people who don't know that, the resignation list is that when the Prime Minister resigns, the tradition is that they give honours and sometimes places in the House of Lords to people they think should have them. But I forgot to say that after the conversation, of course, there will be questions for the floor, which may be in English, French, or Spanish. English or French, yes. So yes, so this was thank you very much. That was very interesting, and thank you for coming this evening. Anyway, let's go back a little bit, because I was talking to some of my French friends who were not students of British civilization, and they assumed that the House of Lords were lords, that it was full of people who were aristocrats. So could you go back a bit into the history and how it came to be full of how it came to have, first of all, women, and then secondly, not a bunch of aristocrats who were just there because their father was a duke or something.
Well, I'm going to do this, the very short, quick version, 3 stops, not long detailed, but we have the Lord Speaker, who's kind of like our chair, and the Lord Speaker sits on the wool sack, which is literally a sack of wool. And that's because the House of Lords was created in the 13th century, and England's economy rode on the wool industry. And so the Lord Speaker still sits on a sack of wool. Now, the average age of the House of Lords is 71, and the people who sit on the wool sack tend to be older on average. A wool sack is really unergonomic. So they all have different little stools and cushions and arrangements to sit on the sack. So it started in the 13th century, and it was the aristocracy. And then gradually, historically, over time, you get the House of Commons, which is the non-aristocracy. But right up until 1954, the House of Lords was entirely earls and dukes and viscounts and barons, and they were all there because of who their father was.
They were also all men, in fact, yeah?
They were all men. There's no women until 1954. And in fact, if you come and see me in the house and I give you a tour, various sons of aristocrats can sit round the steps of the throne, because actually this is a little bit of arcania. You'll see when each new session of Parliament sits, there's a King's speech, and the King gives a speech setting out what his government is going to do in the next year. And round the steps of that throne, the oldest sons of members of the Privy Council and all kinds of things like that can sit there. And there's what used to be the ladies' gallery up above. And the story goes that back in the 19th century, there was lots of aristocratic marriages made with glances between the steps of the throne up to the ladies' gallery up there. So, aristocracy, quick stop in the English Civil War, because the House of Lords has been abolished before. It was abolished during the English Civil War when we had a Commonwealth and no king. The king came back and the House of Lords did too. 1954, they didn't just have aristocrats anymore. There were then the life peers appointed, as I said. There's been for a long time and still is 26 bishops who were all Church of England bishops. And
In the house.
sitting in the house, we have special bishops' benches. And if you look at the television, you will see they have special white robes. And they're not allowed to vote unless they're wearing their white robes. So there was once, one of the old timers was telling me there was a big controversy because a bishop tried to vote and he wasn't wearing his robes. So his vote couldn't count.
It makes you think that, you know, Asterix must have been right, you know, ils sont fous, c'est anglais, you know?
But then the next stopping point is 1999, and Tony Blair came in, was supposed to be going to get rid of all of the aristocrats, all of the people who were there by accident of birth. But in the end, there was a compromise. And so we now have 92 members of the House of Lords who are still the aristocracy. And these are possibly the world's strangest elections, which have been happening until very recently, that if one of the Conservative, the Tory peers resigns or dies, other Tory peers of the same status get to elect from the eligible people who gets to be the new Tory peer.
So you have elected aristocrats.
We have elected aristocrats. And sometimes if you take like the Liberal Democrats, who are our third party, kind of Macronistas, sort of, and they only have a handful of hereditary peers. And so they have like 5 people who are the electorate to elect one person. And so you have these really strange elections. I've said all of that as the current time. The current Labour government that's just come in, they plan to, and in fact, in 2 weeks' time, I will be debating in the House the second reading of the legislation to get the hereditary peers out of the House of Lords.
You said there were 92 hereditary peers still,
Yep.
and 26 bishops. And how many life peers appointed by the Prime Minister, approximately?
Well, the current membership, this changes from day to day, is about 820. So it's the second largest chamber in the world. Only the Chinese People's Congress is larger, which you might take as not much of a recommendation. There are also what I call the fig leaves. I don't know, does that translate?
Les feux de vigne.
So the people who are the excuse for the House of Lords. So some of the life peers are people who are appointed by an independent commission, not by the Prime Minister. There's about 120 of them, and they're people who are appointed for their contribution to public life. So there's Sir Simon Woolley, Lord Woolley, who was the founder of Operation Black Vote, who did a lot of work tackling inequality issues in politics. There's John Bird, Lord Bird, who was the founder of The Big Issue. There's Deborah Bull, who used to...
The Big Issue?
The Big Issue.
They're not going to know what that is.
Ah, right, okay, sorry. It's a magazine that's sold by homeless people to help them get their lives sorted out. And so it was a big organisation that helped homeless people. And John Bird, he spent time in youth detention. He comes from a very disadvantaged background. So he's a very unusual member of the House of Lords. There's Deborah Bull, who used to be a famous ballet dancer. So, and there's like former Lord Chief Justices of England and Wales. There's people who, you know, are appointed because they're experts and they've really achieved things in their life. I describe them as the fig leaves because people go, oh, but you know, the House of Lords is really good that it's not elected because it's got all these expert people in it. But that's about 120 out of about 800. Most of the life peers, there's an organisation, if you'd like to find out more about this, just this week, called Tortoise Media, which is doing an expose on the House of Lords this week. And it's divided House of Lords people up into 7 categories. And one of them, the categories is people who've donated lots of money to political parties. And that is a major category of people who've been appointed to the House of Lords because they've appointed lots of money. And we have many scandals, and I won't run through all of them, but one, if you want to look up a classic one, there's a woman called Michelle Mone, who was a lingerie entrepreneur who was appointed to the Conservative benches. And I'm an old newspaper editor, so I shall put this in a tactful way that I can't get sued for. Let's say she and her husband seem to have got very rich during the COVID pandemic. And they supplied lots of materials to the government that she had very close links to. Let's put it that way. And which were crap. Yes.
It sounds like a new Netflix series of alternate history, doesn't it? Okay, so I thought it'd be interesting to see then sort of what the work is actually like. You know, what would be a typical week for the House? Not that we'll come to you later, but for the House, I mean, we've all read the textbooks. You know that the laws have to go forward and backwards because they like walking forward and backwards, I don't know. So let's start with what would you say that the House of Lords in general does, which is useful work?
Well, one of the things the House of Lords does, and it's interesting because I went and talked, we have, of course, in Holyrood in Scotland, we're talking about one of your theses is about Scotland. They have, Scotland is a separate country within the United Kingdom, and they have their own parliament. But they only have a parliament of one chamber. And when I went and talked to the Green members of the Scottish Parliament, they were very much saying that there's a real problem with having one chamber, is that people don't see, legislation doesn't get scrutinised, legislation doesn't get looked at line by line to see, is that the best way to express the law?
Is it ambiguous?
Is it unclear? Should we tighten this law up, just make it technically better? And if there's one thing that the House of Lords does do very well, is it does look at a lot of technical stuff. And I talked about the former Lord Chief Justices, and there are some very high level lawyers in the House, and they do work. And also, we are also able to politically really point out some of the political missteps of the government. And if I think of an example of this, we had the agriculture bill. So we call it a bill when it's going through the House, and then it becomes an act, which is the law. So when we were working on the agriculture bill, the Conservative government had managed to write an entire agriculture bill that did not have the word food in it. It didn't mention food. And we actually got food written into the bill. It was one of the things we spent a lot of time working on. And we also got written into the bill a requirement that I think it's every 5 years, the government has to make a report to Parliament that will then debate about what the state of food security for the UK is.
So it's like checks and balances in a way, is the American expression.
Very much so. We're there to challenge, and you know, if you take a probably more political example, people may have heard of the Rwanda bill, the Rwanda Act, which the previous Conservative government wanted to take refugees arriving in the UK and fly them to Rwanda and leave them there, even if they proved that they were refugees. The House of Lords resisted that very hard. We went to, you were talking about bills going back and forth. We described that as ping pong, because literally there's someone, they're not quite dressed in tights these days, but someone very formally trots between the two chambers holding a piece of parchment, and it ping pongs back and forth between the houses. So we amend the bill, and then the Commons throws out our amendments, comes back to us, we amend the bill again, and back and forth it goes. That's why it's called ping pong. And I think we went to 4 or 5 cases of ping pong with the Rwanda bill, because it was the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, was saying this bill cuts a great hole in the global refugee system. And the House of Lords was very strong in standing up for it. But this is why I would say why I don't believe in an unelected House of Lords. I think we should have a fully elected House of Lords, because what happens finally is that the House starts to go, and you can see people kind of shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot when you point out that you're actually driving a cart and horses through international law and you really shouldn't be doing this. People go, oh, but we're the unelected House and we can't stand up against the elected House. And I did give a stonking speech at about 2 AM where I know I had an impact, because the minister shouted back at me, and people don't generally shout in the House of Lords. So it's a real score when you make the minister shout at you. You know, the question that I asked on the Rwanda bill, and I've asked on other bills too, is, you know, it's ultimately, you don't mention the Nazis because you always lose when you mention the Nazis, but ultimately it's the Nuremberg question. If you're not going to stand up and draw a line against this, where do you draw the line?
Now, obviously, when there were more aristocrats in the House of Lords, there was an inbuilt majority for the Conservatives. Is that much less the case now, or is there still basically an inbuilt Conservative majority?
Well, there is, the Conservatives never had, I mean, we've just had 14 years of more or less Conservative government. They've never had an absolute majority. So there's always been, if Labour and all of the other opposition parties and a significant number of crossbenchers united together, crossbenchers, yes. Crossbenchers are the non-party people. So most of them are the ones who are appointed through that independent process. But some people may be appointed as a party person and decide they don't like their party anymore, and they join the non-party people. And just for the sake of completeness and to fill this out, we also have non-aligned people, who are people who've usually been thrown out of their party, but the crossbenchers won't have them. So that's the other category. The crossbenchers will only accept people if they really believe they've kind of disavowed their party, and the people who've been thrown out very often won't disavow their party. So, sorry, going back to where I was, right through the Conservative government, if you got all of the non-Tory people together, the Tories would be defeated. And in fact, through my time, I went into the House in October 2019, and right through the Brexit process and right through things like the Rwanda bill that were really controversial, the Conservatives got very upset and would regularly yell at the crossbenchers and say they were being too political because they were beating the Conservative government too often in votes. They've never had a majority. But the interesting thing is, of course, Labour now doesn't have anything like a majority. There's something like 63 Conservative hereditaries there. So throwing those out is going to bring it more into balance, but Labour still won't have a majority. But of course, you can remember that the Prime Minister can appoint whoever they like and how many people they like. There was one point when I was in there was some big controversy. I can't even remember which controversy it was now. And there was talk that Boris Johnson was just going to appoint 100 peers to stop us blocking him. The only thing that stops that is you can only swear in 2 a day. That's what the rules are. And so it would take you quite a long time to appoint 100 new peers. So that's about the only control there is.
Yes, and so let's come on to what your experience of the House of Lords is. I mean, the question I wanted to ask is, how do you resist the temptation to throw a lot of fruit at some of these look? But that's not really the most serious question. Let's say, what are some of the things you've done in the last couple of months, which you think would be in some ways for you justification that it's good that you're in there? Because I was just looking at your new book, as this her new book. It's called Change Everything. Now, well, if you have friends walking around saying change everything, they don't usually then say, I know, I'll go to the House of Lords. That's the place to start. So, you know, tell us some of the things that you get to do. So I know that when you're a member of the House of Lords, you can do things which are not directly connected with the laws going through.
You can, but you actually have quite an amazing amount of power in that one of the, it's a fiction, but it's also true. And it actually goes back to those aristocratic origins, I think. There's a theory that every member of the House of Lords is equal. So you're, you know, I can't tell you how strange I found it the first time that I said, I entirely agree with the noble Duke, the Duke of Wellington, and I'm really glad that he's going to support my amendment and vote for my amendment. It was a very strange experience, but whenever I say Duke of Wellington, I always think 19th century, although the guy who's the Duke of Wellington now is just a perfectly normal person, but
it's a pub as well, isn't it?
I'm sure it is. So everyone is equal, and actually, unlike the House of Lords, I can put down an amendment to any bill. I don't need anyone to second it. I don't need any other person's backing, and the House will then debate that amendment. And this is actually different to the House of Commons, because down in the House of Commons, they only debate amendments that the Speaker and the Commons has selected. And so if, you know, with Caroline Lucas or one of the 4 Green MPs now down in the Commons, if they want to put down a radical amendment, it won't get debated in the Commons because you need backing from a number of parties. Whereas I can put down the most radical amendment I can think of, and then I actually force Labour, Lib Dem and Tory to actually provide a response. And if they try and dodge a response, I can bounce up in the middle of the speech and say, you know, will the noble lord please answer the question? So it actually gives me the chance, and one of the things that when I first really started to understand this, it would have been about 2021. People may have heard of the idea of creating an international offence of ecocide, which is a parallel to genocide. So it's destroying an ecosystem in simple terms. And there's a whole big international campaign, very serious, very well supported international campaign to create under the Rome Statutes an offence of ecocide. And I actually put down an amendment, and it was purely chance the timing. They just had a big high-level international commission to create a new legal definition that they thought was actually a workable legal definition. And we had the first debate in any parliament about the ecocide. And I had an amendment that said the British government will back the campaign to create an international offence of ecocide. I was able to put that in the Environment Bill. And what was really interesting was Zach Goldsmith, Lord Goldsmith, was then the Environment Minister. And I won't get into the detail of Zach's politics, but he has his green sides. And he actually wanted I've come up with a form of words to suggest that the government would sort of think about doing something about kind of backing it. And if he'd said those words, the campaigners would have been absolutely exultant. And I not only put down the amendment and forced this debate, but I threatened the Conservatives with calling a vote. Now, I knew I wasn't going to win this vote, but I was just threatening to call a vote. And one of the things, we might talk about this later, the strange thing about the House of Lords is most days we start sitting at 2:30 or 3, and so we finish about 10 p.m. in the evening. And this was late in the evening. And so I was threatening to call the vote, so the Conservatives had to keep the whip on. They had to keep their people there to make sure they didn't accidentally lose a vote. So I was threatening a trade-off. If Zach will say these words, then I won't call the vote. Otherwise, you're going to have to keep 100 Tories here just in case. And Zach wanted to say these words. I know he did. But the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office wouldn't let him say the words. And so at about 9 p.m, the Chief Whip, Tory Chief Whip, came over to me and said, "Oh, I'm really sorry, but we just can't get the FCDO to do this." And he looked at me like I was an unexploded bomb. But at that point I said, well, okay, I'm not going to call the vote because there's no point in just making trouble for the sake of it. But I got that, all of that discussion and all of that focus on ecocide just because I could put down an amendment.
And I mean, I understand that you're very much there as a representative of the Green Party, although it seems to me that the control that the Green Party has on you is based on your goodwill. You know, if you were to want to ignore everything your party said you could, anyway, you wouldn't do that. But that was not what I wanted to ask you. I think there are things that you can do in the House of Lords about encouraging campaigns and so on. I know that you invited to the Lords representatives of different campaigns, which then, of course, the press is more interested. Could you give us a couple of examples of things you've done? I thought some that I really liked, which I've forgotten.
Okay, yes. So, I mean, just having the title, you know, I find this a little uncomfortable, but it does mean that people listen to you more. And I can also, you know, I'm always telling people there's a trade-off here, and that I can book a free high-profile room in central London with, you know, kind of grand like this, but with all of that. The trade-off is that people have to come through security, which is a right pain, but that's the trade-off. And so, for example, I mean, I do a lot of work on factory farming. The way in which chicken and pigs and dairy cattle in particular are held in internal, very crowded, horrendous conditions. And I also, you know, so I have campaigners who come and they hold a meeting and they have that meeting there, and they can then have all those photos of them being there at Parliament. There's also something, a phrase or an acronym you may hear a lot of in British politics, which is APPGs, which is all party parliamentary groups. And so that by definition, you have to find a tame Tory if you're a radical group. So for example, there's Tim Jackson, who was the author of Prosperity Without Growth, which, if you know, was one of the very early books that started to acknowledge we can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. And we have an all-party parliamentary group that debates growth. It's about the only group that does debate whether we have to be in a post-growth age. And we find a tame Tory, and so then we can be an all-party parliamentary group, and then we put out reports as an all-party parliamentary group. Some of the things, perhaps more obviously, I mean, I was until recently co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group on Hong Kong. And that's an interesting story in itself, in that I'd actually only been in the House a week or two, and a campaigner came up to me and said, will I be the co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group on Hong Kong? And I said, don't you actually want someone who knows where the loos are? It tended to be people campaigning on human rights in China were people from a very right-wing perspective, and they were seeking to balance that up. And I think that's actually really important. And so as the all-party parliamentary group on Hong Kong, we put out a lot of reports about human rights abuses in Hong Kong, about the way the campaigners were treated. You may know, it's in the news at the moment, Jimmy Lai, who was the editor of Apple Daily. And what's really nice about it is every time the APPG puts out a report, the Chinese government gets really upset. And so that's kind of demonstration of how you can use the power. It's not parliamentary procedure, but just being in Parliament and being that APPG is useful.
Yes, now I know that there are presently proposals to reform the House of Lords again. I mean, they've been going quite slowly. I mean, the big reforms of the House of Lords, 1911, 1954, 1999. I mean, the English are not very fast at doing this. But I wanted to speak a little bit about that. But first of all, I just wanted to check in the room here. I would like you to raise your hand if you are sure about how the members of the Sénat in France are elected. C'est the upper house in France. Thank you. Il n'y a pas de honte. En général, les gens ne sont pas trop au courant. And we're not going to tell you, so you'll have to look it up on Wikipedia. So that's interesting that the French do have a system, but it's not a system that interests people. I mean, here we have the intellectual cream of the next generation, and they don't know. Oh dear. But to get back to you, there is a little Democrat proposal for a new. For an elected upper house, is that right? Or what are the chances of that going anywhere?
Well, I will have to say that there is actually a Green Party proposal for a fully elected house. In fact, one of the first things I did after I gave my maiden speech, so my first speech in the House, I trotted up to the bill office with my private member's bill, which was the Elections and Other Reforms House of Lords bill. You can look that up. It's all there set out on the internet. Although it was actually my fellow Green peer, Jenny Jones, who did the work on it first. And so that's a proposal for a fully elected House. And it would be, you'd be allowed to be elected for only one 10-year term. So you'd be elected every 5 years, you'd elect half the House. You'd only be allowed to be elected for one 10-year term. One of the big things is, you have to work out how you make it different if you had a properly elected House of Commons, which we also don't have. But if we had a fully elected House of Lords, how do you make it different to the Commons? And so there's a rule in that says once you've been in the Lords, you can't then go to the Commons. So it's set up with the idea that you would not be a place you set up a political career, but you go and do 10 years of service to the country, and then go and do something else. I think I should at this point, I have to at this point talk about the UK is not a democracy. You might like to discuss whether France is a democracy. I'm going to leave that all to all of you. But we have a government in the UK that was Sir Keir Starmer won the support of 34% of the people who voted in the last general election. That is the lowest percentage in post-war, post-Second World War history. We have the first past the post system, so it's one constituency. You might have 10 candidates. People can get elected as the MP, as the Member of Parliament, with 25%, 27% of the vote. And as the Green Party, we've got 4 MPs. If it was a proportional system, as most of Europe has, we would have 40 MPs from the percentage of the vote that we got. So the UK is not a democracy. Parliament does not reflect the will of the people. And that's without even referring to the unelected House of Lords. And I do a lot of work. If you want to look up some of this, there's a great organisation called Make Votes Matter, which was founded by young people. It started actually after the 2015 election with a 17-year-old who started a petition and got hundreds of thousands of signatures on his petition because the 2015 election was so unfair. And they do a lot of work of talking about how we are not a democracy. But they also say sometimes, I talk about an elected House of Lords and they say, oh, but, we want to focus on the Commons. That's where the government's for. But if you did create an elected House of Lords without reforming the Commons, you would immediately have the most enormous constitutional crisis, because the Lords would then have more democratic legitimacy than the Commons would have. So, we are a total mess, and we also have a deeply dysfunctional system of government. I mean, I've spent 5 years in the House watching a Tory government go, look, we've just done something, we've pulled a lever, we've passed a law, and it's not connected to anything. It's all just like election campaigning, it's not really governing. And, you know, we're only 4 months into the Labour government, but we are very much seeing them really struggling to actually manage to govern. And I don't have a view on what it's like in France, but in the UK, the government is not working, just ignoring the ideological content, but it just can't function.
Well, the time has come. I mean, I could do this all night, but the time has come to see if we have questions from. I'm sure we do have questions from the floor, which can be in English or in French, and priority to the younger people present, or the old people are allowed to ask questions also, but priority to the younger people. Just raise your hand and speak loudly.
Questions. How many women in the House of Lords?
Yeah, I have to repeat the questions to the Zoom. How many women are there in the House of Lords?
We're about, I think the last figure I saw was 28%. So the 92 hereditaries are all male. And that's because England has male primogeniture in our aristocracy. There was one hereditary woman who came from Scotland, and she stayed until the age of 96 or something, I think, because she was just staying for that reason. But since she's gone, all of the hereditaries are male. And of course, the bishops, give them some credit, the Church of England, they actually have it's complicated how the bishops come in, but they're actually prioritising female bishops until they get to 50% bishops. So we will have 50% female bishops before we have a 50% female house otherwise.
That's impressive in itself. Mary Elizabeth, I will repeat the question.
You mentioned something which in Britain a lot of us find a scandal, which is the resignation lists that all prime ministers have used to absolutely stuff the House of Lords with their minions and whatever it might be. How long do you expect this system to continue? Because when you see that somebody like Liz Truss was allowed to nominate so many people, it's just scandalous.
Yes. How long do you think the resignation list, which is rather scandalous, will continue?
Well, I think it will continue as long as the House of Lords continues. I cannot see, but we have such a crooked, broken system that I think the whole thing will blow apart. It's not the case that we're going to see small-scale reforms. I mean, I can actually cite The Economist, not known as a radical source of news, that actually has an article this week talking about, gosh, the British political system really isn't working, is it? And one of the things, talking about proportional representation, one of the things that people often say is, oh, but that will let Reform, what's now the Reform Party, used to be the Brexit Party, used to be UKIP Party, Nigel Farage's party for shorthand. Oh, but a proportional system, they would have got about 80 MPs rather than the 5 they got in the election just gone. But the thing is, of course, that what a first past the post system does is that it allows the far right to just take over the right-wing party and take over the government. I only have to, sorry, we haven't set it up to now, I only have to say the word Trump to point that out very clearly. And I would say Boris Johnson also was a far right prime minister, and Liz Truss was, well, Liz Truss was Liz Truss. So, and I would also say that the Brexit referendum result, the slogan that won the Brexit referendum was "Take back control." And people felt like they were not in control of their own community, their own lives. Their MPs didn't represent them. And I actually wrote a comment piece before the vote saying they're absolutely right. But the problem was never Brussels. The problem was always Westminster. So, when the change comes, I think it will be a massive change. It won't be a small, I mean, we will see the hereditaries go. It's interesting that there's a right-wing conservative who's trying to throw the bishops out at the same time, just because he's trying to make that as a political gesture kind of thing. I don't think that will happen. I mean, one of the things about the bishops is that we actually do things. I mean, I've never sat in any of these. We have debates and we pass laws of England about things like the governance of the Church of England on the Isle of Man. And this is because we have an official establishment church, and the Church of England and the state are amazingly intertwined. And just untangling that is going to be an awfully large job to sort the mess out.
Is it possible to get rid of the hereditary from the House of Lords without getting rid of the king? Hereditary is hereditary, you know.
Yes. I mean, I will note the Green Party is a Republican party. It's speaking in a particularly British sense, that we don't think that anyone should have a place in our constitution because of who their father was. I did once have a bit of fun when I was Green Party leader. I put out a press release that said, I think it was when one of the royal princes was born, and I said, this child should be able to do whatever he wants with his life on his 18th birthday. You might call it human rights for royals. People shouldn't, and you know, that whole foundational problem of people's birth deciding where they end up is a real structural problem in the UK, and you have to say royalty is part of it. But to directly answer your question, Sir Keir Starmer wouldn't dream of even thinking about that.